Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Both Labour and the Conservatives have been setting out their plans for the economy today, and one thing seems clear. Whichever party's in charge after the election, there's going to be a lot more borrowing and spending than we've seen for a very long time. Labour have pledged to invest an extra £55 billion a year on infrastructure like housing and schools, as well as environmental projects. That's roughly double what the Conservatives are offering, an extra £20 to £25 billion a year. So, is this going to be the battle of the big spenders? Here's our economics editor, Faisal Islam.
The northwest of England, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, and today on either end of the East Lancs Road, the Chancellor Sajid Javid in Manchester and the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell in Liverpool, launching a fiscal revolution, a fundamental change to policy on borrowing and investment, and not sounding too different.
It means investment on a scale never seen before in this country.
It means billions of pounds more to spend on the infrastructure revolution that this country needs.
Just down the road from here, my granddad and my
John
dad...
McDonnell in his hometown announcing that a Labour government will not try to bring the national debt down as a rule, and instead will increase borrowing to fund hundreds of billions in investments to solve what he calls the social and climate change emergencies.
Isn't it interesting? After all the years I've been arguing, since I've been Shadow Chancellor, that's 4 years, I've been arguing that we need to invest. And the Tories have attacked me, abused me, as though I'm some revolutionary. Now they're falling into line, but on a scale that doesn't meet the challenges we face.
Because they want to keep the debt down?
Well, because they're not willing to recognise that governments have to borrow to invest.
Labour wants to make investments in infrastructure such as the Mersey tidal energy scheme not far from here, and they argue that the value of the asset should be taken into account, not just the debt required to fund it. That's called a net worth target and has not been tried in a major economy before. Such is the deluge of spending here that there are doubts that it could even be actually spent. Labour's message is a little like saying on a national scale that a homeowner shouldn't worry about the value of a mortgage in isolation. The value of a house and investing in it matters as well, and that frees up hundreds of billions of borrowing to spend on investment. The Conservatives criticise the extent, but the basic idea of changing the rules to take advantage of currently low borrowing rates for governments, that is rather similar. In his case, tens of billions more in borrowing in order to allow an increase in annual investment by a half, unlike Labour, who want to double it. Mr Javid does promise the total of the UK's historic borrowing would be kept in check, but scrapped the formal rule demanding it falls.
Excessive debt would risk everything the British people have worked so hard to achieve over the past decade of recovery. The question at this election is, who do you trust to protect that?
These plans are independent of what happens with Brexit, but over at the Bank of England, 2 out of 9 policymakers voted for new interest rate cuts amid fears that weak global growth and trade barriers from the new Johnson Brexit deal will hit the UK economy. Other opposition parties, such as the Lib Dems and the SNP, said that cancelling Brexit would be the best way to boost the economy. Whoever wins next month, we appear to be on a journey to more investment and more borrowing too. Quite the change from the previous 3 elections. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
The former Labour MP and Minister Ian Austin has said that Jeremy Corbyn is completely unfit to be Prime Minister and has urged people to vote for Boris Johnson instead. Mr Austin, who left the party in February and is not standing at the election, accuses Mr Corbyn of failing to tackle anti-Semitism. It comes after Labour's Deputy Leader Tom Watson announced he was stepping down as an MP, but for personal reasons. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
The buses look the same, but it's not just the season that makes this a very weird election, as one senior MP put it. Inside both the big parties, there are serious doubts about the leaders. Jeremy Corbyn's track record of handling or not handling fast enough racism against Jews is under attack again.
Anti-Semitism is a poison and an evil in our society. I have spent my whole life fighting against racism. I will die an anti-racist.
But two of his former MPs simply don't believe that.
Not fit to hold high office.
There's no love lost between these two and the Labour leadership, but for years they were both deeply loyal lieutenants of the party. Listen to them now, urging you to choose not a Labour Prime Minister, but a Conservative.
If you're not going to do what's right on a fundamental question like racism, what are you going to do it on? I wouldn't say Boris Johnson is unfit to be our Prime Minister in the way that I say that about, about Jeremy Corbyn. I think the country's got a big choice to make, and I think Jeremy Corbyn's completely unfit to lead it.
And another who worried about anti-Semitism is off too. Tom Watson, the deputy leader, survived an attempt to oust him a couple of months ago. But he's standing down, he says, for personal reasons. Not all of Mr Corbyn's supporters in Liverpool are sorry to say goodbye.
I think good riddance.
Why'd you say that?
Because this election comes down to a brutal choice, and that needs a socialist government. And if you're not a socialist, then, shut the door on the way out.
I do think that the party now is united more than ever, and I think that we just need to, as Labour supporters, mobilise.
Every party has its massive divisions.
As he heads off around the country, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, wants to look ahead to the next few weeks. But the Labour leader cannot completely escape the ghosts of his past problems. These early days haven't been an easy ride for Boris Johnson either. Concerns about candidates, resignations and departures.
I vowed not to drink.
And in Scotland, where the Prime Minister broke his campaign booze ban, the party might struggle to keep their 13 seats.
We're the party that's saying, let's, come on, get together as a whole UK, let's get Brexit done, get this thing over the line, and then get on with bringing our great country together and unleashing the potential of the whole UK.
The Tories' rivals in Scotland, though, are only too happy to have him on the trail.
I'm so confident that Boris Johnson will not go down very well with Scottish voters in this election, that my words to him as he leaves Scotland this afternoon may be, haste you back.
But convincing victories come to parties that can reach beyond their own tribe. This time, no politician can see clearly round the corner.
And Laura is in Darwin in Lancashire for us tonight. Laura, we've seen how leadership has become an issue in the campaign so far, and today it was Jeremy Corbyn under attack.
That's right, George, and Mr Corbyn ran slap back into a problem that has come up for him time and time again. His ability to deal with allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and this has been going on for several years now. And it's not just about one voice criticising him or one politician's concerns. This speaks into a wider problem that a lot of people in the Labour Party worry about. Now, there's no question that he has legions of really committed, devoted supporters. You see that everywhere he goes around the country. We'll see it every day of this campaign. But there is a fear of whether or not the wider public really sees that appeal. One member of the shadow team of Jeremy Corbyn's, who's been loyal to him, said to me today they worry that people just may not want to trust him. And that is a fundamental problem, whether it's on anti-Semitism or anything else, that the Labour leader has to grapple with in the next few weeks if they're to have a proper shot at a real victory.
Laura, thank you very much. The Liberal Democrats, the Greens and Plaid Cymru have agreed not to stand against each other in dozens of seats across England and Wales at the general election. The three-way pact aims to give the strongest candidate the best chance of winning. All three parties want the UK to remain in the EU. Alex Forsyth reports now from Winchester, a constituency that is currently held by the Conservatives and where the Greens have now stepped aside in favour of the Liberal Democrats.
The country is poised to make a crucial choice, but in some seats it will be a limited one. Winchester is one place some anti-Brexit parties have agreed not to stand against each other.
I think it's a really good idea. I think that's the only way we've got a chance of staying in the EU.
I think anyone trying to hijack for or against Brexit is wrong.
In this current Tory seat, it means the Green Party won't put up a candidate, but the Lib Dems will. The idea, to avoid splitting the pro-EU vote. The Lib Dem leader, whose party could benefit most, argues Brexit is key in this election.
It speaks volumes about how high the stakes are, how important this is, that these parties, ourselves, the Liberal Democrats, with the Green Party and Plaid Cymru, have been able to put aside those narrow party interests to work together in the national interest.
There are 60 constituencies where agreement's been reached between the Lib Dems, Plaid Cymru and the Green Party. 11 in Wales, the rest in England, targeting Remain areas like here in Winchester. But without Labour involved, the effect could be limited.
It's hard to know how much difference this might make. It could only have an impact in perhaps a small handful of seats. But this, more than most, is an unpredictable election. And even a handful of seats could be crucial.
In this eco-hub in the city centre, local businesswomen Harriet and Laura have their reservations.
There's a lot of logic behind their kind of unifying together. But Brexit will be over, however it is over, and then we need to move on as a country. And without all the voices being heard, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Both wanted to remain in the EU, but have concerns about efforts to stop Brexit.
The country voted to leave, so I do wonder if we should be following what that decision was. I would prefer that they all put themselves up, they said what they wanted to do, and then we were given the opportunity to vote for those parties.
Whether this limits choice or focuses minds, the Brexit lines are now clearly drawn. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Winchester.
And the next government will borrow more and spend more if either of the two big parties win the election. The Conservatives and Labour have both announced plans for massive increases in spending on infrastructure and public services, funded by more borrowing. The Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell said under Labour there would be investment on a scale never seen before. The Chancellor, Sajid Javid, claimed the Conservatives would bring about an infrastructure revolution. Our political editor Gary Gibbon is in Westminster. Gary.
Well, what a change from just the last general election only 2 years ago, when the Tories were accusing Labour of having a magic money tree, threatening to borrow recklessly. And here are the Tories now, by their own measure back then, borrowing recklessly. They would argue not. There's been a real row in Number 10 about just how far to go down this route. The Conservatives want to appeal to former Labour voters in Labour-held seats where they know these voters feel they want more investment in infrastructure, and so that's why they've hopped to this track. But the Tories always, when there's a general election, want to accuse Labour of a tax bombshell, and how well that can land when you're spending billions yourself is a moot point. The voters, some in the Tory party worry, won't greatly distinguish between tens of billions and hundreds of billions. But those are the kinds of differences we're talking about. And in Labour circles, you sense there's a certain sense of liberation, that there has been an emerging consensus in economic fora that maybe now is a good time to borrow even more than Labour did last time. Labour feel very comfortable in these clothes, even though they make some economists wince a little. One of the things about the last general election was that people felt economics never really got a day on the stage. But here we are only a few days into this one, and we've had it very much dominating the election scene.
A new era of borrowing for building may have begun in British politics, with both the Shadow Chancellor and the Chancellor saying they'll ratchet up spending on infrastructure to levels not seen for decades.
You know, incredibly, at the moment, we can borrow in real terms at negative interest rates, meaning it is a responsible time to invest. And there's a growing consensus around the world that the time to do that is now.
With the low interest rates that we've got, there's no shortage of demand for government bonds across the world. You know as well as I do, the IMF, the World Bank and others now are saying now's the time to borrow to invest.
We're looking at both parties really wanting to ramp up investment spending a great deal, but there's nevertheless a lot of clear water between them. Labour is talking about literally doubling the amount of spending that government does at the moment on investment. The Conservatives are talking about an increase of maybe 40 or 50%.
More investment in our schools, in our NHS, in our environment.
And it means investment on a scale never seen before in this country.
In cash terms, that's the Tories promising £22 billion a year extra public spending on infrastructure. Labour talking £55 billion a year extra. Labour said vote for the real deal. The Chancellor tried to head off voters who might think his spending spree gave them a licence to back Labour's bigger one.
He might as well, McDonald, say $1 trillion, $2 trillion, $3 trillion, because they're meaningless numbers, because even if he tried to do what he said, if he tried to keep his word, he will crash the economy.
These are the people who all of a sudden are now gushing with election stunt offers of spending more. They just take us for fools, don't they? Judge them on their record and their actions.
Both speeches were being made in the north of England, a critical battleground in this election. The Tories are eyeing a whole raft of Labour-held seats from North Wales to the North Sea coast, which could be taken on a 10% swing or less. Many here voted Leave. Many more feel the north has been neglected.
The centre of political gravity is shifting away from London. It's coming back home to the north.
We need to level up across the country. That means whether you're living in the north or the south, that every part of the country matters.
Boris Johnson visited Tetley's factory in the northeast today. Both main parties insist they wouldn't borrow for current spending.
We invented the round bag.
Everyday cash spent on workers in hospitals or schools, for instance, suggesting austerity might not be over for much of the public sector, or big tax rises are on the way.
We've had huge cuts to things like local government and transport and various other departments. If the parties aren't borrowing for that purpose, then those departments aren't going to see any particular change in their profile.
Unless there's big tax hikes.
Yes, exactly. And I think we've heard from on the Conservative side actually talk of tax cuts. Whereas I think for Labour, if they were to follow what they did back in 2017, for instance, they would say, yes, we'll put a lot more money into NHS, police and so on and so forth. But to do so, they would have to have big tax rises.
Finding the projects and personnel to build billions worth of infrastructure in a hurry could be very challenging. And all this spending hinges on interest rates remaining at their historic low.
Of course, we have no idea really how long that's going to go on for. It's been going on for a decade. It looks like it's going to continue for a considerable while. But I think one of the lessons of the last 50 or 100 years is that what looks like it's going to go on forever never does.
Whoever wins, the state could be returning to a size not seen since the 1970s, with a new consensus on the wisdom of borrowing, but a big divide on how much and how fast.
Gary Gibbon there. Well, we did ask the Conservatives for a Treasury Minister or another party spokesperson, but none was made available to come on the programme tonight. But joining me from Westminster is Labour's Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Treasury Minister. Annalise Dodds, thanks for joining us. Sajid Javid says you're indulging in fantasy economics and that John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn want to make this country sick and unhealthy again. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm afraid he's clearly not looked at what we're actually saying we want to do. The question for anyone watching this tonight is whether we can afford not to have the kind of investment that John McDonnell set out today. We've got the biggest productivity gaps in all of Europe. We've got the biggest gaps in investment between our richest areas and our poorest areas in all of Europe. We really need to do something about this. And of course, we've also got to take advantage of that new green industrial revolution and create hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Labour set out today exactly how we would do that. We've costed it. And actually, it's making very much use of the fact that we can currently borrow over the long term at low cost so that we enhance the size of the economic pie for the future. If we don't do this, we won't have sustainable economic growth in the future.
And yet, figures from the Office for National Statistics show that wages are at an 11-year high. The employment rate is the highest since 1971. So actually, there's a case that the UK economy is actually quite resilient.
Well, actually, in relation to wages, yes, they're at that high now because we've seen wage stagnation for 9 whole years. We're actually the only country in the whole of the G8 where we've seen a return to growth after the financial crisis, and yet people's living standards stagnating. We really need to do something about that. A real part of that problem is productivity. A big element of the reductions that we've seen in productivity growth in some areas of the country recently has been to do with a lack of investment, also a lack of investment in education and skills as well as physical infrastructure. And we're saying we would step up to the plate on this. If we don't do something about it, then in subsequent years we'll find ourselves falling even further behind our competitors than we are already.
So your plan is just to outspend the Tories. For every pound they promise, you're going to promise to spend plenty more. The Greens are saying they want to borrow $900 billion over the next decade. Why don't you match them too?
Well, no, we're not basing this on some kind of arbitrary arms race between parties. We've based our investment plans on what actually the CBI, the TUC and other actors are saying is necessary to bridge those investment gaps. So we've looked at what is missing when it comes to, for example, ensuring that we can make the most of the wind energy revolution, ensuring that we can really make sure that all of our regions keep pace and grow as they should be doing. That's what our plans are based on, not some kind of arbitrary figure, quite the opposite. We've looked through what the needs of our economy are and set them out as part of this programme.
I mean, the UK faces an uncertain future. If you win a majority, we're going to experience a second referendum, possibly a referendum on Scotland. Very uncertain political times. Is that wise to engage in so much spending?
Well, we would have very uncertain future times indeed if we end up with yet another Boris Johnson government, because we know that although Johnson has set out a deal already, it's one which obviously would be pretty reckless with the economy and which doesn't set out what our future trading relationship would be with the EU or indeed with other countries. So with Johnson, we most definitely would have a lot of economic turbulence. Actually, when I talk to people who are involved in the money markets, people who are involved in the city and in financial services, they say there's that big investment gap, and very often we find that we've got a shared agenda in dealing with that investment gap.
Just very quickly, while we've got you here, Tom Watson, the Deputy Leader, has left. He comes from a very different wing of the party to Jeremy Corbyn. Do you think the next Deputy Leader also needs to come from a different wing, or should they be someone more closely aligned to the Corbyn project? And who are you thinking about?
Well, obviously, it would be the membership who would determine who the deputy leader should be. I mean, I personally have to say I think Tom's done incredible work, particularly recently around diabetes and really pushing that fight against sugar and those who profit off in health and lack of good health in our population. So I know he's going to be working on that in the future. I want to continue working with him as well within the Labour Party on that. When it comes to the deputy leader, as I say, that will be determined by our membership. We're above all a democratic party.
A very diplomatic answer there. Annalise Dodds, thanks very much. Well, back to election news now, and a local BBC radio presenter who said women should keep their knickers on to avoid being raped has been chosen as a Conservative candidate for Parliament. Boris Johnson called Nick Conrad's comments unacceptable, but said he had apologised long ago. Mr Conrad made the comments in 2014. The Labour candidate Jessica Barnard said people deserve better, and the Liberal Democrat candidate Ben Goodwin said the comments were vile. Our reporter Simeon Brown spoke to Mr Conrad in the Broadland constituency in Norfolk.
We came here to speak to the Conservative candidate for Broadland in Norfolk, and that man is Nick Conrad, the former local BBC radio host. Now, despite being a man who's earned a living asking questions, it felt like he's been afraid to answer them. And we came to ask him about the comments he made in 2014, in which he said that women should keep their knickers on to avoid being raped. He also said if you jump into bed naked with a man, if you give him all the signals and then he acts upon them, then you are partially responsible. Now, Nick Conrad has apologised since those comments were made, but he's now running for public office. And many people have said that somebody who's expressed those views are unfit for office. Even Boris Johnson has condemned those comments. And today, we managed to catch up with Nick Conrad as he was leaving. Many people say that you're unfit for public office for the comments that you previously expressed. What did your response to them?
Well, I'm terribly sorry. I know I've kept you waiting all day, but I've been told that CCHQ will be talking to you at some point this evening.
No, but you're here and we're here.
I know, and I absolutely promise you that we're waiting on that statement, and CCHQ will speak to you
Why
this
do you need to
evening.
wait for a statement? Many people feel you're unfit for office because of those comments that you made.
I know.
What do you have to say to them?
I apologise. I stand by that apology. That apology is so important and it's so heartfelt. That apology is so genuine that CCHQ are going to give you a statement.
Despite the apology, we were told earlier by one senior member of the association behind me that they had known about the comments before selected him and that Nick Conrad was a great candidate.
Simon Brown reporting. Now, the Lib Dems, Plaid Cymru and the Green Party have agreed not to stand against each other in 60 constituencies across England and Wales. The group, calling itself Unite to Remain, says the election pact could consolidate the anti-Brexit vote. In England, where Plaid Cymru doesn't stand anyway, the pact simply means an agreement between the Lib Dems and the Greens. But in Wales, two parties will duck out of each seat, boosting the third candidate's chances of success.
60 targeted seats where splitting that Remain vote will make all the difference. Because this isn't a normal general election. Anybody that tells you it is not being truthful. This is a general election that's all about Brexit. Whether we're going to leave on whatever Boris Johnson manages to get through, or whether we have an opportunity to stay. And these parties recognise this.
Well, if the Conservatives had a rocky start to their election campaign with the resignation of a cabinet minister, Labour are fast catching up. The party's deputy leader, Tom Watson, resigned last night, and this morning Ian Austin was one of two former Labour MPs to declare Jeremy Corbyn unfit to lead the country, urging voters to back Boris Johnson instead. Our political correspondent Liz Bates has this report.
The Labour Party should be looking forward, with a general election just weeks away, but today past grievances were rearing their heads. Ian Austin and John Woodcock, former Labour MPs and long-time critics of Jeremy Corbyn, went further than ever in their condemnation of the Labour leader, saying that when it comes to next month's vote, they'll be supporting Boris Johnson.
The country faces a stark choice. There's only two people who can be Prime Minister on December the 13th, Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn. And I think Jeremy Corbyn's unfit to lead our country. And on that basis, I'll be voting for Boris Johnson.
The pair said Mr Corbyn's record on dealing with anti-Semitism allegations made against Labour and his past links to terror groups, including the IRA and Hamas, should bar him from ever entering number 10. And senior Tory figures agreed, declaring the comments proof that Jeremy Corbyn is unfit to be the next Prime Minister. However, Conservative peer Baroness Varsi, who has previously branded her own party institutionally Islamophobic, said the Tories had lost the moral high ground on racism a long time ago.
Look, it's not for me to... I'm going to get into an argument with Baroness Varsi about these things. But, look, I don't think they're on the same scale. And I think if we try to suggest they are, then we're minimising what is clearly an institutional problem in the Labour Party.
In a letter yesterday, Labour's deputy leader Tom Watson made a shock announcement that he was leaving frontline politics. And despite ongoing tensions between him and the Labour leadership, he insisted that the decision was personal, not political. But speaking yesterday ahead of his resignation, he said the party must root out anti-Semitism within its ranks once and for all.
I think it's very important that everyone in the party challenges any anti-Semitic behaviour as hard as is possible.
And a further blow today from the Jewish Chronicle newspaper. It used its front page this morning to send an unprecedented message to non-Jews, telling them the vast majority of British Jews consider Jeremy Corbyn to be an anti-Semite. Confronted with the claims as he was on the campaign trail today, Labour's Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell was defiant.
Why has Ian Austin and the Jewish Chronicle both decided that that choice must not be Labour?
Do you know, in this room you'll be able to talk to others, but I think we stand in the best tradition of British socialism.
He went on to launch a counterattack at Ian Austin.
He's now employed by the Tories. What else do you expect him to do in an election campaign where you're employed by the Tories, you speak on behalf of the Tories? That's what this was about this morning.
Mr McDonnell's office later clarified that he was referring to Mr Austin's unpaid role as a government trade envoy. Also called on today to defend the latest anti-Semitism claims against his party was the Labour leader.
Anti-Semitism is a poison and an evil in our society. Any form of racism is a poison and an evil in our society. I have spent my whole life fighting against racism. I will die an anti-racist.
A day of tough questions for Jeremy Corbyn and for Labour. But will any of this really dent their chances in the general election?
With respect to both Ian Austin and John Woodcock, they are not big names. They have said what they've said today, and I think it will cause some very bad headlines, already is, but that will pass relatively quickly. I think for the Labour Party, the decision of people like Tom Watson to stand down is more serious.
A serious problem today, maybe, but with many more weeks of the general election to come, Labour will be hoping Jeremy Corbyn's supporters will be the ones taking centre stage from now on.
Liz Bates reporting, and the former Labour MP Ian Austin joins us now. Why, for you, is this the most important issue of the entire election?
Look, I think that Jeremy Corbyn is not fit to lead the Labour Party and not fit to lead our country. I think he's spent his entire time in politics on the extreme fringes, working with, supporting, defending all sorts of extremists, and in some cases terrorists and anti-Semites. I think he always seems to back Britain's enemies, if I'm honest, John. I think whether that's the IRA during the Troubles, or describing terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends, or when Putin sends people to murder people on the streets of Britain, Jeremy Corbyn parrots the Kremlin line. So I think he's completely...
But you've been happy to work with him all this time.
Well, to be fair, John, I think I was arguing about... I was making these arguments in 2015 during the leadership election, and I haven't changed my views at any point since.
Maybe you should have blown the whistle a lot earlier.
Well, look, I left the Labour... Well, I've been arguing about this, I've been campaigning about it, I've been trying to change things in the Labour Party. I left the Labour Party earlier this year, not to join another party, but to shine a spotlight on the disgrace it's become under Jeremy Corbyn, and to demand that other people step up and do something about it.
You know better than I do that we don't live in a presidential system. You've toiled amongst many Labour MPs, many of whom are trying to run again. Have you no faith in them?
Well, look, I think...
What about all the people you've left behind? I mean, you're just kind of dumping them.
Well, look, I think in the end, John, the country faces a choice. And there's only two people who can be Prime Minister on December the 13th. And that's either Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn. And I think, look, I'm not a Tory. And there are lots of things that Conservative governments have done over the years that I profoundly disagree with. But in the end, I think Jeremy Corbyn is completely unfit to lead our country. And I think this as well, John.
I mean, it's one thing to leave the party and complain about the leader. But to advocate then Boris Johnson, who himself has been accused of racism, calling Muslim women pillar boxes, talking about Pekininis. I mean, are you happy with him? You're advocating a man who's made other racial slaves? I mean, where are you?
Well, that's not language I would use. And I think on the issue about...
It's not the language, it's the ability to say it.
Well, look, I think to be fair to him, on the Muslim women point, what he was actually saying, I mean, I wouldn't use that language, but what he was actually saying was he was defending women's right to wear whatever they want. But look, is there a problem with Islamophobia in the Tory party? Of course that's got to be dealt with, no question about that. Is Sajid Javid or Nusrat Ghani, are they being driven out the Tory party by racists in the way that Luciana Berger or Louise Arman were from the Labour Party? And has the Tory party been institutionally poisoned from top to bottom in the way that it has?
Well, let me just give you one...
And look, the Labour Party...
Let me just give you Windrush. Are you really happy to support a party which did this to Afro-Caribbean people who were sent back to the Caribbean despite being British citizens?
I'm not happy about
hundreds of them, and we have just spent £600 million correcting that.
This isn't the choice that I wanted to be in front of the country at this election, and I tried my level best to prevent this being the choice, and for the Labour Party to have a reasonable centre ground candidate, fighting for Prime Minister. So that's what I campaigned for. But I'm afraid, John, this is the choice now. This is, and I just want to make one point on this racism issue, which is that the Labour Party is the first political party in history to be subject to a full inquiry by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and people should be appalled about that.
Let's bring in Dominic Grieve in Beaconsfield, standing as an independent, former Attorney General. Where do you think we are now? I mean, this isn't a presidential system, but nevertheless, the leadership seems to be the issue. And you presumably, as standing as an independent, don't like either of them, but one of them's got to be Prime Minister.
One of them is likely to be Prime Minister. Obviously, I would hope that if Boris Johnson wins the election, he does not, or becomes Prime Minister, he does not have an absolute majority overall, and that therefore it's possible for others to exert influence on the party and prevent him doing things to our country that I think will be uniquely damaging. I also worry very much about Boris Johnson's character.
So
what
do you make?
Happened in the last 3 months, from proroguing Parliament to the use of Number 10 as a propaganda machine spewing out lies, is not a very good start.
But what do you make of a Labour MP putting his full faith in Boris Johnson as a former Labour MP, but anyway, standing as an MP? What do you make of him putting all his weight behind Boris Johnson?
I can well understand why a Labour Member of Parliament should think that Jeremy Corbyn is a serious menace. I happen to share that view, and to take the view that if he were to become a Prime Minister, that also would be utterly disastrous for our country. So I'm totally respectful of colleagues who express the views that he has done, but ultimately the country is going to face an extremely difficult choice. I'm standing as an independent because of that. I'm hoping that I may be returned as an independent and can exercise my judgment as to what's best for my country thereafter. Everybody in this election is going to have to consider, I think, the candidates, and may well find that they find candidates who fit their view of the sort of moderate politics we need. Then those could be drawn from different political parties. I think it's the best we can do in the circumstances.
Dominic Grieve, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry we've had you so short a time. We had a communication problem getting you, and thank you very much, Ian Austin, too.
Thank you.
Fatima.
Thank you, John. Now, the Brexit Party chairman, Richard Tice, has announced he'll stand in Hartlepool for the upcoming general election. It's a traditional Labour stronghold, but the Brexit Party believe they can win it because nearly 70% of the town voted leave in the referendum. Our political correspondent Paul McNamara reports from Hartlepool.
Would he or wouldn't he? Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage said he wouldn't run to be an MP. But what about Chairman Richard Tice? Today, the obligatory pose.
I'm delighted to be standing as the Brexit Party candidate here in Hartlepool in this general election. And we plan to win, and win big.
So why Hartlepool? Well, in 2016, almost 70% of people voted to leave the EU here. But that presents another question.
There will be some people that look at you and say, here is a man at the party who said that they're anti-establishment, and yet here you are doing the oldest trick in the book. You're finding a seat you think is going to be the easiest for you to win, and you parachuted yourself in.
I say to people, listen, Hartlepool voted for Brexit. 7 out of 10 people voted for Brexit, and they are cross, they're angry that it hasn't been done. So of course, it's a key target seat. We've got, dozens and dozens of target seats all over the country, in South Wales, the North Midlands, up here in the North East. And, we're focusing on those and making sure that we can win those.
The Brexit Party candidate for Hartlepool was a chap from the North East.
Ken Hodcock, great guy.
He was the chairman of the local football club.
Yeah, that's right.
What makes you, millionaire property developer Richard Tice, MEP for the East of England, a better person to represent Hartlepool than him?
Ken's a great guy, but his business commitments, his business is doing well, meant that actually, given the timing of this election, he just couldn't give it the time and the commitment that was required. So, we had
That's very convenient, isn't it?
No, Ken was keen to do it, but the reality is he's a very successful businessman and, just couldn't do it.
Fortunate then that Mr. Tice was able to step in. Not that the man who won in 2017 agrees.
I'm from this town, I live in this town, I'm not parachuting in for whatever phony reason. I don't live down south and then pretend that I live here. I'm rooted here, and I know the people well, and the people trust me.
Mike Hill might be from this town, but he's not always entirely in step with it.
People around here voted overwhelmingly to leave. You personally voted to remain. The Labour Party now want a second referendum, and just last month you voted for Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. You're all over the shop, aren't you?
Voting for Boris Johnson was something that, as a Labour MP, I was loath to do. Going through those lobbies was horrible, believe you me, with the Tories, with the government. But it had to be done because we had to move it on to the next stage and get that deal moved forward so it could be properly scrutinised. I can hand on heart say that as a constituency MP, I tried to deliver for the people of my town who voted very heavily, yes, at the referendum for Brexit.
Mr. Hill insists that when he walks these cold streets and knocks doors, it's not Brexit people want to talk about or that will dictate who gets their vote. For you, universal credit, that's the one thing you're
The
thinking
biggest thing in my vote is universal credit, and Labour are going to take it off the table.
I don't know who to vote for. I have no confidence in any of them.
So you don't know who, but what is it that you're thinking about when you go in to vote for? Is it issues or is it Brexit?
Both.
You're thinking about it quite hard. A lot of people are saying this is really simply the Brexit election. Are you even fussed about Brexit?
No, I'm not bothered about Brexit. No, I'm sick of Brexit.
Not so long ago, the Conservative Party thought they had a once-in-a-lifetime chance to take this seat from Labour for the first time ever. Today, they had nobody available to talk elections, no candidate named yet to fight here, and a Brexit Party multimillionaire on a charm offensive swooping in on their voters. This seat has always been Labour, and when asked in 2016, they said Brexit. But in 2019, both are on the polling card.
In an election campaign marked by wide political divisions, there was unity of sorts between the Conservatives and Labour today, that borrowing is back in fashion. The two men vying to become the next Chancellor, Sajid Javid and John McDonnell, were setting out their stalls today. For decades, we've been used to Tory chancellors urging financial restraints and their Labour counterparts promising investments in public services. Well, now both are promising large public expenditure. For Mr McDonnell, it will be investment on a scale never seen before. For Mr Javid, borrowing can go up if the money is invested.
What happened to austerity? It's still here. Politics may have moved on, but there are communities like this one in the northwest still feeling the effects of years of cuts. Labour knows how to spend it. The Shadow Chancellor was in his home city of Liverpool playing to a home crowd. John McDonnell promised £400 billion to tackle climate change and social deprivation, all of it funded by borrowing.
That means change, real change. And it means investment on a scale never seen before in this country, and certainly never seen before in the north and outside of London and the southeast.
It's great to be back here in Manchester.
Meanwhile, a few miles away, the Conservatives, not being as conservative as perhaps you'd expect. Money is cheap to borrow, and Sajid Javid plans to spend more of it. But he insists you can trust him with the nation's finances.
We can borrow in real terms at negative interest rates, meaning it is a responsible time to invest. And there's a growing consensus around the world that the time to do that is now.
The Conservatives will borrow more, but claim they will do so prudently. Their cap on annual borrowing will rise to 3% of national income. Our national debt will rise too, only to be cut if interest costs exceed 6% of government revenue. And the Conservatives have ditched their promise to eliminate the deficit altogether.
The age of irresponsibility is giving way to an age of austerity.
Since the financial crisis, the Conservative Party's fought 3 elections on the need to tighten our belts. Just 2 years ago, the message was one of restraint.
And in the long run, we can only spend what we earn.
Now all that's changed. The question is, who do the people of Manchester trust with the economy?
They don't do what they say they're going to do. They promise you this and they promise you that, but they never keep their promises, do they?
I used to be a Labour voter. Massively changed my ideas about it, sadly.
All these spending promises rely on the economy performing. Today, the Bank of England published its latest growth forecasts based on a new assumption that Brexit will happen and on the terms Boris Johnson negotiated. The Bank of England expects economic growth to pick up in the next few years, reaching 2.1% by 2022. Now, these forecasts are slightly weaker than the bank made 3 months ago. And the bank calculates that while Boris Johnson's deep free trade agreement with the European Union will remove some uncertainty and boost business investment, it will also damage trade. And the net impact is slightly negative. The spending pledges Labour and the Conservatives are making will be judged by voters and by investors here in the City of London. Money is cheap to borrow now, but that will change if lenders start to wonder if they'll get their money back. John Hills, News at 10.
And Robert Pessin is here in the studio with me. Robert, how significant do you think what we heard today from Sajid Javid and John McDonnell will be as the campaign plays out?
I think actually this issue of investment in schools, hospitals,
transport. It's going to be hugely important. When I talk to MPs, actually a surprising number are saying they're not actually getting sort of shouted at about Brexit on the doorstep. What people want to talk about is public services. Now, there are two things I think to say about what we've heard from the Shadow Chancellor and Chancellor today. Both are ripping up austerity. You know, even under the Tory plans, on my calculations, very difficult to see how the national debt, which remember doubled since the financial crisis, won't continue to rise. And if you just remember how important it was to George Osborne and David Cameron that debt should fall, it will rise if Boris Johnson remains as Prime Minister. And now it'll rise a lot more if Labour takes office. Some economists think that's sensible investment at a time when, as we've seen from Joel, the economy is not growing very strongly. Some are worried that it will scare off international investors. What I'm interested in is the politics, which is whether essentially voters will think, well, what Boris Johnson is offering isn't quite as generous, but maybe it's sustainable, versus a hunger for better public services, and thinking that actually what Labour are offering will fulfil or will fill that hunger. I think it's going to be terribly, terribly important, actually, as it goes on. One other thing very important, it seems to me, is that Labour are also saying a lot of the decision-making about this will be transferred to the north of England, fulfilling what some would say is a hunger, particularly from those who voted for Brexit in the north of England, for more power.
OK, very quickly now, news of another person pulling out of the campaign. What can you tell us about
day after day, both parties suffer these humiliations. As it turns out, their candidates have said and done things that, you know, have embarrassed their parties in the past. There's a chap called Nick Conrad who a while ago made some comments which shocked a lot of people. Actually, he was a BBC presenter when he said these things, and it was that he thought that women, if they wanted to avoid rape, should keep their knickers on. He's withdrawn tonight because he says that he recognises that if he stays in the contest, he's going to embarrass the Tories. So Tories looking for another candidate.
All right, Robert, thank you very much indeed. So if the day is ending with problems for the Conservatives, it began with dissenting voices from two former Labour MPs this morning. They said Mr Corbyn was not up to the job of being Prime Minister and told voters to back Boris Johnson instead.
Backstage before his first big rally of the campaign, Jeremy Corbyn running through his lines. Huge rallies were a feature of the last election that gave his campaign energy and momentum. For a leader with old problems resurfacing, his view from the stage must have been an encouraging sight.
Jeremy Corbyn is still being treated like a rock star by the Labour faithful, but outside these events, there are those who have lost faith.
In London, this was the message not from the Tories, but from what should have been his own side. Ian Austin and John Woodcock, until recently Labour MPs, now urging others to vote for Boris Johnson.
The truth is that only two people can be Prime Minister on December 13th, Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson. And I think that Jeremy Corbyn's completely unfit to lead our country. And that's why I think people have got to vote. I'm telling decent, traditional, patriotic Labour voters to vote for Boris Johnson and to make sure Jeremy Corbyn gets nowhere near Downing Street.
Ian Austin was a close ally of Tom Watson, who resigned as deputy leader yesterday, citing personal reasons. Both had fought the leadership over anti-Semitism. Today, this Jewish newspaper led with this stark front page, declaring that the vast majority of British Jews consider Jeremy Corbyn to be an anti-Semite, and the near total inaction of Jeremy Corbyn and the rest of the Labour leadership in dealing with anti-Semites in the party has both emboldened them and encouraged others.
Our party has confronted the issue. We have suspended or expelled members. We have an education programme, and all of that has been set up since I became the leader of this party.
In Liverpool today, Jeremy Corbyn launched Labour's battle bus.
And I'm so proud of our party, our determination and our unity to win this election.
But it's the disunity in his party that he's never been able to heal, the anti-Semitism allegations he's never been able to escape, that may yet cost him dear. Romilly Weeks, News at 10, Manchester.
Well, one of the accusations levelled against Brexit is that it would lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. Today, the Prime Minister, who is campaigning on a slogan of getting Brexit done, was in both Scotland and Northern Ireland, insisting that was not the case. He says the Conservative Party is the only one which can hold the UK together. Well, Mr Johnson is in the East Midlands this evening, and Paul Brand is there too. Paul, what did you make of his first campaign events outside of England?
Well, Raggy, as you say, for all the talk of Brexit in this election, it's not the only union in play here. There's also the crucial issue of the United Kingdom, and we've just returned to the East Midlands after a tour actually of 3 constituent parts of it. The Prime Minister began this morning in Stockton South in England, where he went to a tea factory for a mug of English brew before then flying to Scotland, where he had a glass of Scotch whisky on a tour of a distillery in Murray, where he argued that the Conservatives are the only party that can stop the SNP from breaking up the UK, arguing that Labour would offer a second referendum on Scottish independence. But while Boris Johnson wants Scotland to remain in the UK, he will, or would, drag it out of the EU against its will. And there are questions about whether his brand of English nationalism, as some would see it, can really counter Scottish nationalism in the way that unionism played so well for the Conservatives in the 2017 election. This evening, though, he moved on then to another part of the union called into question by Brexit, Northern Ireland, where he visited a crisp factory just outside Belfast. Of course, the DUP are arguing that exports like crisps would have to face a border in the Irish Sea under Boris Johnson's Brexit plan. He carries on campaigning here tomorrow in the East Midlands. Then he goes to Wales, the final bit of the union. Is he the man, though, to save the union? Some think he may be the man to sever it.
OK, Paul Brand in the Midlands, thanks very much indeed. Well, pollsters have said that this election could well be the most unpredictable in years. They could see all kinds of political alliances and permutations in which traditional party political loyalties could be turned on their head, and hence today a pact agreed between the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and Plaid Cymru in Wales not to stand against each other in 60 seats to create what they call a Remain alliance. The Liberal Democrats will be given a clear run at 40 seats in England and 3 in Wales. The Greens will run unopposed by the others in the pact in 10 seats. And Plaid Cymru will be able to contest 7 seats in Wales, where the Lib Dems and Greens will stand aside. To see what effect this might have, we can apply it to the 2017 election results. For example, Plaid Cymru won Arfon in northwest Wales by a razor-thin margin of less than 100 votes. If some or all of the 648 Liberal Democrats' votes went to Plaid, instead, it theoretically makes the seat easier for them to hold next month. And in 2017, the Greens got nearly 1,000 votes in Cheltenham. Well, next month, they'll stand aside for the Lib Dems, potentially putting them in a strong position to steal the seat from the Tories. But the parties say the goal isn't just to boost each other's chances of being elected, it's to provide a unified candidate who is standing against Brexit. Well, with me is Professor Jane Green, one of ITV News' election analysts and a leading member of the British election study. Jane, from what you know from your research, it's a very volatile sort of voter picture in the country. Is it clear whether these floating volatile voters, which way they're headed, whether it's to the Remain alliance or elsewhere?
It's not clear at all. I mean, what we've seen in British election study data over a really long period of time is, as you say, more people switching their votes between parties, between general elections. Now, the thing is that could mean that there's more people switching between the Remain parties, between the Leave parties, even between the major parties. We have yet to see. It all depends on the campaign and which of the parties are offering those volatile voters the most promising prospects.
I suppose one of the really interesting things that people want to know in this sort of world where we're talking about tactical voting, with Brexit being such a huge issue for sort of people, and that cutting across all parties in terms of, you know, Remainers being in Tories and so forth in Labour. What are the seats, from your analysis, you've seen the list, what are the seats that could be really up in play, that could be interesting?
So what's really interesting about the Remain alliance is that it's actually quite hard to see where this pact is going to make a decisive difference. So one reason reason for that is that actually the Greens stood aside in many of the same seats as they're standing aside in this election to help the Liberal Democrats. So if we compare to 2017, we're looking at the kind of same kinds of seats. And also, if you look at where the polls are for the Liberal Democrats, the Liberal Democrats were on at 6-point-something%, almost 7% of the vote in 2017. They're roughly double that now. So it might be that the Liberal Democrat increases on their own are enough to mean that those Liberal Democrats' gains are going to happen with or without these other smaller parties. And so, in a sense, it's quite tricky to see, well, where are the really decisive seats? And you look at seats like Winchester, where there could be a potential there. And you also look at seats, certainly the Bristol West seat for the Greens, they would look at their 2015 result and think that that could be a prospect for them. Although in 2017, it was a Labour hold with a large Labour majority. And so there are a number of seats where it could be a little bit more beneficial for the Liberal Democrats. They might hold the seats more easily. But it's not easy to see that this Remain pact on its own is going to make the decisive difference. Now, where I think it could be interesting, though, is that this message that these are the Remain parties might mean that tactical Remain voters from the Labour Party and also from the Conservative Party might look at these Remain alliance MPs, and that message and that kind of appeal might start to matter in seats where the Liberal Democrats are contesting with the Labour Party, seats like Bermondsey.
Brilliant. Jane, thank you very much indeed. Now, if the Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson is to have a chance of making good on her ambition to become Prime Minister, her party needs to take seats from both Labour and the Tories. Their battleground across Britain includes Remain areas like Newbury in Berkshire.
This 1,000-year-old market town has seen political creeds come and go, and now, if traditional parties are giving way to Remain or Leave, could it benefit the Lib Dems?
I don't actually agree with the revoke Article 50 stance of the Lib Dems because I think it is an undemocratic thing to do. But in Newbury, they are the most likely party to unseat the Conservatives.
Donington Castle is at the crossroads of major routes, north-south and east-west, and during the English Civil War, it saw its fair share of bloody battles. Now, things are more genteel, but even so, it is looking out over a deeply divided country. One of the key questions for the general election is whether the Liberal Democrats can harness Brexit unhappiness to reshape the political landscape of Britain.
Long-time Lib Dem observers think they could do it this time.
You do now have a committed, angry subsection of the British public who are pro-European and feel completely ignored. In a sense, it's much more fertile territory for the Lib Dems than it has been in the last couple of elections.
Here, the Lib Dems are a long way behind, but still, if they are to win the 100 seats they dream of, they need to be Newbury's cup of tea.
Do you think many people around here will go Lib Dem?
Personally don't. Apart from putting money into mental health, it's all about Brexit. There is nothing about raising money, spending money, or what they're going to do, so I can't see it.
We called Colin Rallings, our election analyst. The Lib Dems can no longer rely on 20-odd seats in Leave voting Devon and Cornwall, he pointed out. And he warned, in some seats their success could boost Boris Johnson.
Many areas where it's a Conservative Labour seat, with the Liberal Democrats starting a long way from behind, is more likely to hurt Labour, because Labour devout Remainers may be tempted to vote Liberal Democrat because they want this whole Brexit thing just cancelled and forgotten.
Half mile to go. This is the... Back in Newbury, the Lib Dems only chase the Tories. Brexit has to feature heavily enough to bring Jo Swinson's party in from distant second.
This is a crowd that thinks it's quite good at picking winners. The question is, how many of them will back the Lib Dems?
I will vote Lib Dems. I think this will be a lot closer this time around than in previous elections.
I will definitely vote Tory. I believe in democracy. So I'm not a Remoaner. I have never been a Remoaner.
And there were real reservations about the Lib Dems.
If we do manage to get out by January 31st, we've just voted in a new government. We've still got 5 years. So what else is beyond that?
First past the post means a general election is never easy for Lib Dems. They may be the most clearly Remain horse in the race, but it is not yet obvious they'll land on their feet. Allegra Stratton, News at 10, Newbury.